Tēnā iwi, I hui hui nei. No mai, haere mai, kei tēnei hui. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Michael Smith, tōko ingoa, no te kahui ma te pukupuku o Aotearoa. To everyone this evening, welcome to this meeting. Greetings to you all. My name is Michael Smith. I work for the Cancer Society. I'm the Chief Executive of the Cancer Society Wellington Division. Welcome to our annual Cancer Update public lecture. Tonight, the lecture is focused on the latest evidence on lifestyle factors and their relationship to cancer. Thank you for coming along this evening, and I'm aware that many of you are supporters of the Cancer Society as either a volunteer or a financial supporter or both. It's great to have you here. A special welcome to our guest speaker, Professor Dallas English from the University of Melbourne. Welcome to our beautiful Wellington city. It's known as the coolest little capital in the world, and I'm not talking about the weather. Tonight's Cancer Update lecture is an annual feature in the Cancer Society calendar. Each year we focus on topics of relevance to cancer control. We also seek to increase public awareness about what the Cancer Society does. I'm sure many of you are aware that we are a major funder of research, of cancer research here in New Zealand, that we provide health promotion programs aimed at reducing the incidence of cancer, and that we provide a comprehensive information and supportive care service to minimise the impact of cancer. And we do all this without government funding, so we rely on the generosity of our New Zealand public. I'd now like to welcome to the podium Dr. Diana Safati, who will introduce our guest speaker. Diana is a public health physician and cancer epidemiologist with a particular interest in the interface between public health and clinical medicine. She is the director of the Cancer Control and Screening Research Group, and also the director of the Postgraduate Diploma and Masters in Public Health program at the Wellington School of Medicine. She's currently leading a number of cancer-related projects, particularly relating to patient and health system factors that influence cancer survival. Diana is currently on the National Ethics Advisory Committee, on the board of the Cancer Society Wellington Division, which is great. She's also involved in the National Bowel Cancer Working Group and the Clinical Advisory Group to the New Zealand Cancer Registry. She's a very busy woman. She's also renowned as a cook for her personal style and great shoes. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Diana, who will introduce our speaker. Diana.
Thanks, Mark. I have no idea where you get your information regarding my cooking. I guess you've seen my shoes, but... As Mike said, my name is Diana Safati. I'm the director of the Cancer Control and Screening Research Group here in Wellington, and it's my great privilege to be a member of the board of the Wellington Division of the Cancer Society. So thank you very much for coming along tonight, braving the winter evening, although the weather's been reasonably kind tonight. Every day, just about, when we read the papers or watch the TV news, we hear about studies which suggest links between common things that we're exposed to every day and cancer. Everything from food additives to soft drinks, coffee, alcohol, cell phone towers, air pollution, the list goes on and on and on. And this is, of course, both confusing and concerning. So it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce Professor Dallas English. He's going to speak tonight about what we should really be concerned about in terms of what causes cancer and ways that we might be able to reduce our risks of developing cancer. So Professor English is the director of the Centre for molecular, environmental, genetic and analytic epidemiology in Melbourne. He's involved in several large cancer-related studies, and perhaps most relevant to this evening, he's an investigator in the Melbourne Collaborative Cohort study, which includes work on a range of lifestyle factors in cancer. He also has expertise in a range of other relevant areas, for example, the role of vitamin D in cancer and also cancer screening. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor English up to the stage.
Thank you. I didn't put the name of the centre on my first slide because it's very long, and in fact when I accepted the job I went to visit some colleagues in Perth, and they said, what's the first thing you want to do when you take on the new job? And I said, I want to change the name. And that person duly reported that back to the person who'd come up with the name. So hence poor Diana had to come through that. I much prefer the School of Population Health, but that's fine. Thank you everybody for coming, and thank you for that kind welcome. The last time I was in Wellington, I walked along the waterfront tonight, which was very beautiful, of course. And the last time I came in, I couldn't wait to get onto dry land because I'd come in from Picton on a very stormy day, very unlike today. And in fact, I think I was the only person who didn't throw up. So what I'm going to do is just spend a little bit of time talking to you about some cancer statistics in New Zealand. Now, it doesn't sound right for an Australian to be telling New Zealanders about their own cancer statistics, but I suspect that, well, I know that in Australia, for example, people often don't have a good understanding of what's common, what's uncommon, what's happening to cancer, who gets it, and that kind of thing. So I just want to spend a few minutes doing that. And in fact, quite a lot of the data that I'm about to show was produced by Diana and her group. So in 2009, these are the most common cancers. You can see that although prostate only affects men and breast basically only women, you can see that they are the two most common cancers in New Zealand, as they are in Australia as well. Melanoma, very common in New Zealand, common in Australia, but most other places of the world you would not see melanoma sitting where it is, and that's largely because of the sun exposure that we get here. Lung cancer, and most places actually put colon and rectum together, which brings it a bit higher up. But anyway, so they're the most common cancers that occur in New Zealand, and the numbers of people that are afflicted by them each year. Often people think that cancer, that people don't survive cancer, which is not true. In fact, with better treatments, cancer survival is improving quite rapidly. So this is taken from a report that was just published this year, showing survival according to those four big ones that I put on the previous slide. So prostate, breast, bowel, and lung cancer. You can see that unfortunately lung cancer has very poor survival, and that essentially has not improved very much at all over time. But if you take bowel cancer, which is the next one, the survival there has improved with better treatments. One of the issues that I'm sure most of the people in this audience are familiar with are the health inequities faced by Māori population in New Zealand and Pacific Island people as well. So you can see that survival there for bowel cancer is much lower for Māori people than it is for non-Māori people. And in fact, that inspired the Ministry of Health to undertake a project to try to understand why that is and to see whether it could be addressed in some way. But you can see that breast cancer has very high survival, and so does prostate cancer. And for breast cancer, there is obviously an active screening program in New Zealand, and for prostate cancer, there is a de facto screening program. And both of those, as I said, have got very high survival. But you can see the inequities. But for many cancers, survival is very high, and for others, like lung cancer, it is unfortunately still low. So often people come to me and they say, well, look, cancer in general is becoming very common in young people. And particularly they think about breast cancer when they think about young people getting cancer. So I show this slide to indicate to you that breast cancer, and all cancer in fact, is predominantly a disease of older people. Now there are some cancers that affect young people, like leukemias in particular, but most cancers occur in people who are older than me, and I'm pretty old. And I've shown you female breast cancer here because that is one of the cancers for which the age at onset or age at diagnosis tends to be the lowest. But if you look at the chart, I don't know whether you can see that, but by age 40, less than 1% of women, or less than 1 in 100 women in New Zealand would expect to have been diagnosed with breast cancer. But by the time you get up to age 80, it's about here, which is 12%, let's say about 1 in 8 or so, women would expect to be diagnosed with breast cancer. And you can see that it rises rapidly with age. And here's bowel cancer, which occurs in even older people. So cancer is predominantly a disease of older people. But prevention really should be occurring throughout life. It begins in childhood and goes on from there. So what's been happening to cancer in New Zealand? So another report from the local group here. And in this report, they looked at a couple of things. First of all, they looked at ethnicity. Oh, it's a little gremlin in the system there, but he keeps coming back, that's good. So they looked at ethnicity, and they also looked at socioeconomic status as determined by income. And those are what the slides that I'm going to be showing you now. So you can see that for males, there's been quite an increase in all groups over the last 25 years. This goes to 2004. And for females, less of an increase. But most of that increase is due to a few cancers. It's not really across the board. It's a myth to think that all cancers are increasing in incidence. It's not true. Here's one that is, prostate cancer. It's almost tripled in its rate from the mid-1980s through to the middle of the 2000s. And that's largely due to better detection, more detection. And a lot of that is what I would call over-detection, which is disease that in the absence of screening with the PSA test would never have been diagnosed in the man's lifetime. And that's one of the major downsides of PSA testing. So I think most of that increase is due to testing rather than to a real increase in the incidence of prostate cancer. If prostate cancer is increasing, we wouldn't know why, because there are no established risk factors for it, basically. So here's breast cancer. As you can see, that also has an increase, and the increase has occurred in people of high, medium, and low income as well. And again, a fair amount of that increase would be due to screening. And some of that, unfortunately, is also overdiagnosis. But the amount of overdiagnosis relative to prostate cancer isn't as great by any means. So here's colorectal cancer, and so here's one you can see that for women at least, there's really been no change over time, or very little change over time. It has increased for men, but not for women. And then here's lung cancer. So you can see for men, it's a good news story. Lung cancer has declined quite substantially over time. Is it anything that I'm doing, or is it just... No. Okay. So you can see it's big for people with low income. It started here and it's come down to there. This is medium and this is low, high income. You can see again the real disparities in the rates here, which are largely driven by smoking, because lung cancer is essentially driven almost entirely by smoking, as I'll show you in a few minutes. So that means, and in fact I've got some evidence to show you, that tobacco consumption has been declining in New Zealand. It's slower for women. It's still going up, unfortunately, and you can see that the disparities are starting to emerge in women, again because of smoking rates. And the reason it's coming down in men and going up in women is that men, their peak smoking periods was really around the Second World War and not long afterwards, and started to decline thereafter, whereas women took up smoking much later. And we won't really start to see the benefits of smoking reductions for women in lung cancer for a little while yet. But we will. So these are the things that I'm going to talk about, some more than others. Some of them I'll just skip over and so if I haven't talked about your favourite topic, feel free to ask me at the end, and I'll either try to answer or I'll realise I know nothing about it and not try to answer. So, tobacco, not new by any means. But the reason I talk about it is the #1 avoidable cause of cancer. So this slide here is taken, Melanie Wakefield, who works with me at the Cancer Council Victoria, has been very heavily involved in the plain packaging legislation that you might have heard about in Australia. So these are the packets. You can see that they're, the kind of thing that would inspire you to purchase one, I think, as a keepsake, but not to smoke the contents. So they've been tested and they've been proven to be very effective. So effective, in fact, that the tobacco industry is challenging them in the High Court in Australia. And hence this cartoon here from Tandberg, which I think is very cute. I like it indeed. But that's really just to say that the reason that we're winning the war against tobacco is because it's been a whole range of activities. It's not just a matter of informing people that tobacco causes cancer. That's only part of it. We've had changes in legislation like this packaging. We've had increases in taxation, a whole raft of measures that have worked together to reduce the impact of tobacco, and that has taken a long time. The first US Surgeon General's report came out in 1962, which is 50 years ago today, and that was the first major report talking about the health effects of tobacco. So it takes a long time, unfortunately, especially when you've got interests on the other side who are entrenched and defending their territory very vigorously. So, again, there's nothing new in any of this. These are all the cancers that the International Agency for Research on Cancer says are caused by smoking. And I've attempted in this column to say about how much of those cancers is actually caused by smoking. So you can see for lung cancer, it's around 85%. And that these figures are unfortunately Australian, but I dare say it's not very different for New Zealand. And you can see that there are others as well for which smoking is a major cause in terms of the proportion of all of those cancers that's due to smoking. And here, as I said before, about 1/4 of all cancer deaths are due to smoking. So again, a question I'm often asked is, well, I've smoked all my life, does it make any difference to me if I stop smoking? And the answer to that is quite clearly yes. So this is a slide that Richard Peto's group put together, and this is based on data from the UK. This is the risk over life for people who continue to smoke throughout their whole life. So by age 75, about 16% of people who smoked all their lives would be dead from lung cancer. But for people who give up at the age of 50, only 6% of them. So you can see even giving up at age 50 is better than continuing to smoke. And these are people who stopped at age 30, 2% of them would be dead from lung cancer by age 75. And if you've never smoked, it's less than 1%. So it's quite dramatic. Giving up smoking is actually a really good thing to do for yourself, your grandkids, everybody. So this is some data on prevalence of smoking in New Zealand, again, this time by ethnicity. And again, you can see the kind of disparities that I was talking about before emerging. So this is people of European origin. You can see that smoking is just over 20%, as opposed to Māori people from female, it's almost 50%. Okay, so that's a major disparity, and reducing the difference, if you like, in health outcomes for the different groups will require concerted effort around tobacco. The same in Australia. You might have heard about Closing the Gap in Australia, which is an attempt to try to change the 20-year difference in life expectancy for Aboriginal people compared with non-Aboriginal people. And one of the ways to do that is to reduce the impact of tobacco. So I know it's not new, and I bang on about tobacco, but I do it for a good reason. Because there's nothing good to be said about tobacco. So, except for this kind of slide. Because you can see here, this is the number of cigarettes per person smoked during that time in New Zealand. You can see it's come down from about 1,800 down to about 1,000, meaning not that people who smoke are reducing their consumption, but fewer people are smoking. So that's a good sign over time for that to be happening. And that's the reason why we've seen lung cancer rates decline for men. Okay, so I'm on from one bad substance to another. I noticed that outside we were served non-alcoholic drinks, which is good. So I'll talk a little bit about alcohol. If I can get my voice back. We've known for very many years that alcohol is a strong risk factor for some relatively uncommon cancers. Cancers of the mouth and the throat, the larynx or the windpipe, and the esophagus. And it causes around half of those. And for some of those, it interacts with smoking. So people who both smoke and drink alcohol at high levels have a very much increased risk of getting one of those cancers, although thankfully they are still relatively rare. And it also causes a substantial proportion of liver cancer. But more recently, what's been learned is that it actually is also a cause of both breast cancer and bowel cancer, which are two of the most common cancers. Now, the thing about those ones is it doesn't increase their risk very much. So for women who drink about 40 grams of alcohol per day, excuse me, which is would be roughly 3 glasses of wine. When we did a little experiment in one of the places that I worked, the wine that was poured was roughly 150 mils per glass, which translates roughly into 40 grams for 3 of those, thereabouts. So what that does is it increases the risk of breast cancer 1.3 times, and that's a funny figure, but I'll show you in a few minutes a way that's a bit easier to think about it. And I think it causes around 4 or 5% of breast cancer, both in New Zealand and in Australia. So bowel cancer is similar. It's a relatively weak risk factor for bowel cancer, and it's only one of many. But again, it is an avoidable risk factor. And I think it causes around 5 to 10% of bowel cancer in Australia and New Zealand. So what I've tried to do here is give some idea of comparing the lifetime risk for people who drink 20 grams per day and versus those who drink none. I had intended to show 40 grams per day as well, but I didn't quite get time to get the figures together. So what I mean by any alcohol-related cancer is that it's cancers of, you can see it's these ones here, and liver cancer, as well as cancer of the bowel. And this is men, right? So we're not talking about breast cancer. So you can see that for men who drink about 20 grams per day, they have about a 14% chance of getting one of those cancers in their lifetime. Now, unlike the UK, which considers a lifetime to be 75, I consider it to be at age 85, which isn't that far different from our life expectancy. And you can see that for people who don't drink at all, it's more like around, my guess is about 12.5 from that figure. And you can see for cancer of the bowel, you can see it's not a very strong risk factor for cancer of the bowel. But it is there, it is present, and it is one of the ways that people could actually reduce their risk for bowel cancer. So similar figure here for women, for breast cancer now being the most common one that's caused by, and you can see there's quite a bit of a difference there in terms of lifetime risk for women who drink 20 grams per day versus those who don't drink any. Just coming back, the Australian National Health and Medical Research Council changed its alcohol guidelines a few years ago to say that people should drink less than 20 grams per day, which is why I used that figure. And that's based upon lifetime risks of getting various diseases and having various injuries related to alcohol consumption. So I want to move on now and talk about diet. This is a slide. This slide is taken from a paper that was written in the mid-1970s by Richard Dole and Bruce Armstrong, both very well-known epidemiologists. And it kind of it started a whole industry in studies on diet and cancer. So what this study was they looked at apparent fat consumption in different countries of the world. And the way you measure that is by what's called food disappearance data. So you know what's being purchased and you know the fat content of it, and you can estimate then how much people are eating. It assumes, of course, that everybody in New Zealand eats the same amount of fat, which probably isn't the case, but that's what it does. And it's pretty crude. And you can see that up here at the top, at that point, which was in the 1960s, was the US, and down here near the bottom was Japan. Well, Japan's now gone up. This is endometrial cancer, which is the lining of the uterus, but it could equally have been breast cancer or bowel cancer. It wouldn't have made any difference to the picture. It would have been the same. So on the basis of this, the hypothesis came about that fat is a strong risk factor for cancer. And so hundreds of studies later, where there's pretty well no evidence that fat consumption increases the risk of cancer. And so I'll go through some of the sort of major components of diet now, just to show you what's going on. But just to say that, let me begin by saying, though, that there are these hundreds of these studies, and they come in various categories. They come in intervention trials where people are allocated at random to get one kind of diet versus another, for example. There's a study called the Women's Health Initiative, which was actually set out to test the hypothesis about fat, and that's where it began. It became more famous because of its findings on hormone replacement therapy, but that's the way it began. And that was incredibly expensive. It cost about $200 million US to do. There are cohort studies of the kind that I do, where we start with healthy people and we follow them forward in time, and we measure their diet when they're healthy and then see which ones of them get cancer. It's pretty gruesome, but that's the way we do our business. But in my study, there are 40,000 people. In some other studies, there are up to 500,000. So you can imagine you can't measure their diet exquisitely well. In fact, we measure it rather poorly. We often use what's called a food frequency questionnaire, where we ask people about the frequency with which they ate certain foods. And then there's case control studies. Well, most of the early evidence about diet and cancer came from those kinds of studies where what you do is you interview people who are what's called cases, the people with the disease, say it's bowel cancer, after they've got their bowel cancer, and ask them about what they ate before they got it. And then you compare that with people in the community who are healthy. All of those studies showed that fruit and vegetables were very, very protective. And 20 years ago, if I'd walked into the New Zealand Cancer Society, I might well have seen a poster on the wall talking about how fantastic it is to eat fruit and veg. I mean, there may still be one, I don't know, but the evidence is a lot weaker than it was 20 years ago. And that's largely because the case control studies have been discredited and the cohort studies don't find the same thing. So most of what I'm going to say comes from the World Cancer Research Fund report, which was done in 2007. It was a very extensive and comprehensive report, and there have been various other syntheses as well of the evidence. So I've already hinted at fat. Well, basically, there's limited evidence, and what's meant by limited evidence is that there is some kind of association. It tends to be inconsistent, so one study might find one and the other one might not. So it is, and by limited, in addition to that, there's also a causal effect is plausible, but you can't rule out bias is a reason for the association. So there's limited evidence that it increases the risk of those cancers. And that's a far cry from where we were 20 years ago, where we said that breast cancer was, fat intake really increased the risk of breast cancer. It doesn't do that. Now meat's one of the few things that has been shown to be consistent, at least for bowel cancer. So it's not a strong risk factor, but it's one of the few dietary risk factors that seem to be coming up in almost every study that I've looked at, in cohort studies in particular. So both red meat and processed meat appear to slightly increase the risk of bowel cancer. And my estimate for Australia is that around 8% of bowel cancer is due to red meat consumption and around 7.5% of bowel cancer is due to processed meat. Now, you can't add those up because some people who eat a lot of red meat also eat processed meat. So you can't say, well, because if you keep adding all these things up, you'll get to 300%. You say, wow, look, what a fantastic way to prevent cancer. We can prevent 300% of it. It doesn't quite work like that. But the evidence is convincing, but it is weak. So by all means, enjoy your steak. But when people ask me, I say, well, if you moderate your intake of red meat, you may well be reducing your risk, but to a small extent. Now, fruit and vegetables. I've already sort of hinted that 20 years ago we thought they were the best things that you could possibly eat. And that was based on case control studies. In year 2000, a big study came out from 2 cohorts in the US called the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professional Study that you may have heard about, which showed no association with fruit and vegetables. And so we looked at our own data at the time, and again, we found no association. So most of the cohort studies don't show much at all. And some of the strongest evidence appears to be for cancers that are related to smoking. And there's some concern by epidemiologists like me that some of those findings might actually be due to the smoking, to people who smoke a lot and they tend to eat few vegetables. And so it's hard to distinguish the effects of smoking from those of the diet. But there are some things. So here's a list, right? If you like lists, here's one for you. This is from the World Cancer Research Fund. The International Agency for Research on Cancer more or less reached the same conclusions a few years earlier. They were a bit stronger, though, because they were more based on case control studies than this one here. Interesting, they did a report in 1997, and there's quite a marked difference between their conclusions from 1997 to 2007. And you can see that the most they say is it's probable that consumption of fruit reduces the risk of cancer of the esophagus, and only limited for bowel cancer, and probable for stomach. So you can see, if anything, it's going to be a weak risk factor. But there's lots of good reasons to eat fruit and vegetables. Don't get me wrong, I used to tell my daughter to eat her broccoli all the time. So it reduces the risk of heart disease. So there's good evidence for that. Even in our study, we've seen that. We don't see it related much to any cancer, but we do see it for heart disease. One of the really good things about eating a lot of things like fruit and vegetables is that they are said to be non-energy dense. What do I mean by that? Well, if you eat a banana, it doesn't have as many kilojoules as if you eat a hamburger, for example. So and one of the big concerns about cancer in more recent years is obesity, which is a topic I'll move on to in a minute. So by eating things like fruit and vegetables, we may actually maintain a healthy body weight better. Fibre is something else that has been around for a long time, ever since Dennis Burkitt noticed that Africans, when they defecated, had huge mounds of the stuff, as opposed to most Western people. When we defecate, we have very small, often hard stools, right? So, I work on bowel cancer. These kinds of things don't bother me, but I know that not everybody is the same. So he came up with this hypothesis about fibre, but the evidence now is pretty inconsistent. However, having said that, there are some more very recent studies using much better ways to measure our diet. So rather than using the food frequency questionnaire that I talked about before, they use what's called multiple 24-hour recalls. So what you do is you ask somebody, say today, this morning, what they ate yesterday, and you go through it very systematically. And then you might do that 3 or 4 times for each person. It's very expensive, but it gives you a much better measure of what they're eating than to ask them how often in the last year did they eat steak, which is a food frequency questionnaire. So you can see, the crudity of what we're dealing with. And there are now online methods for doing that, which are going to be the way of the future. Okay, so it's a pretty weak risk factor. So eating a lot of fibre isn't going to do you any harm, but it's not going to reduce your risk of bowel cancer by very much. It might make you a little bit uncomfortable. It might make your friends a bit uncomfortable to be around you, but it potentially could reduce your risk by a little bit. So then I'm going to come on and talk about vitamins and minerals. And really, all I'm going to say here is to just give you some sort of cautionary tales. The first thing is that vitamins, the way I like to get my vitamins, is packaged in food. And it's very hard to separate out the effects of, because food is complex. It's got lots of vitamins and minerals and things in it. It's very hard to separate out the effect of one single thing. We've tried to do that several times, and we've often done it in a very unsuccessful way. Like several years ago, 20 years ago, there was a strong belief that beta-carotene decreased the risk of several cancers. So there were 2 randomised trials done where smokers, who were people at high risk of lung cancer, were given beta-carotene or a placebo, and what happened was the beta-carotene increased their risk. So it's not, we haven't been very good at looking at our diet, and what we've been trying to do, and this was particularly true in the 1980s and 1990s, is we were trying to find magic bullets, and they don't really exist. Our diet is too complex for that. So more recently, we've been looking at folate, and you know that there's been a recent decision around folate fortification. But folate isn't just from folic acid that's found now in bread-making flour, but it's also found in leafy green vegetables. And there is convincing evidence for at least pancreatic cancer and some limited evidence around esophageal cancer and bowel cancer that it reduces the risk. But another cautionary tale there is that there was at least one randomised trial done with people who had pre-existing polyps, polyps being the precursors to bowel cancer, and it showed that it actually, giving them folic acid, actually increased the number of polyps that they had. So, there are all kinds of concerns about giving pharmacological doses of these micronutrients that occur in relatively small amounts and separating them from the food. So by all means, eat a nice, healthy diet, but don't worry too much about giving yourself very expensive urine and taking minerals and vitamins. That's my feeling. So there are a whole long list of vitamins. I could talk for hours about all of them, but I won't. I won't bore you. I just want to talk very briefly about 2 minerals. One is calcium, for which the evidence for bowel cancer is really strong. And the same kind of trials, in fact, one of them done by the same person who did the folate trial I just talked about, have shown that people with polyps given calcium actually reduce the number of polyps they have. So calcium appears to be protective against bowel cancer. And that's a good story. But then I move on to selenium, which I'm sure many of you know that in parts of New Zealand, the soils are not very replete with selenium. So several observational studies, like the kind that I do, had showed that people who ate foods with a lot of selenium in them had lower risk of cancer, particularly prostate cancer. And there was a trial as well that showed that. So that the trial that was done didn't actually have prostate cancer as its main outcome. It was looking at skin cancer. So then there was a group in the US and another group in France that went and designed 2 trials specifically to look at selenium, and lo and behold, it didn't decrease the risk of prostate cancer, it increased the risk of prostate cancer. So, I could name vitamin E that was used in trials, increased mortality. So a lot of these kinds of trials have been shown not just that feeding these things in large amounts is not beneficial, it's actually potentially harmful. But I don't want you to go away feeling scared about that. But I, for one, I'm certainly not going to be taking selenium to reduce my risk of prostate cancer. And what you do is up to you. Now, so let me come back to a product, if you like, of what we eat, and that is what our body shape is. And I'm talking about obesity. So the way that we usually measure it is through the body mass index, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, even if you wouldn't have any idea how to calculate it. It's not the most intuitive measure to calculate. Why would anyone come up with something like our weight divided by the square of our height? Anyway, that's what it is. I prefer waist circumference, There's a lot of studies in recent years that have shown that waist circumference is actually a stronger predictor of not only cancer, but also diabetes and heart disease than is body mass index. So body mass index is okay, and it's relatively easy to measure because you just need to measure height and weight, but waist circumference is better in terms of its prediction. The only problem is that actually women seem to know where their waist is, but blokes don't. So this bloke here, who shall remain nameless, he probably thinks that's his waist, right? Well, I've got news for him. It's not. It'll be more like there. So I'll show you, actually I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so this is looking at body mass index now, and these are relative risks. So basically what the relative risk is comparing the risk of dying from cancer for people of a particular body mass index relative to those who had a body mass index of around 24. So this was done in a great big pooled analysis of cohort studies, and ours was one of them, with about 1 million people in the studies. And it's the most precise analysis that we've yet got. You can see it's been restricted to people who never smoked. The problem with body mass index is that smoking actually reduces the body mass index, and so you get all this, what's called confounding by epidemiologists. So we've got rid of all that, and you can see that people who, there's a very nice, well, I call it a very nice, but it's not very nice actually. With increasing obesity, there's an increasing risk of cancer. And people who have very low body mass index also have an increased risk, possibly because they've got pre-existing disease. So that's body mass index. In our study, as I said, we preferred to look at waist circumference, although we looked at body mass index as well. This is now a measure of the relative risk that I talked about before per 10 centimetre increment in waist circumference. So let's take postmenopausal breast cancer. That's my estimate. So I come down here, and you can see that for every 10 centimetre increment in waist circumference, it increases the risk by about 1.1 times, which isn't huge. Postmenopausal breast cancer is related to obesity, but it's not one of the strongest ones. So you can see we had others that were more strongly related. Endometrial is one of the ones, the lining of the uterus is probably one of the ones most strongly related to obesity. And then there's this one here, which is badly named, but basically it's essentially dealing with the top of the stomach and the bottom of the esophagus, a particular kind of cancer that's increasing probably faster than any other cancer in most Western countries, including Australia and I assume New Zealand as well. And the reason for that is because of increasing obesity. Even though we had very small numbers, it's actually strong related. As a result of that, the Cancer Council of Victoria made an advertisement around waist circumference. It's a lot easier for people to think about a waist circumference than it is about their BMI. It's relatively easy to measure, provided you tell a bloke that it's around your belly button and not on your hips. And there are reasonably... The only problem is there's no real agreement yet on what those figures should be, but we are in the midst now of doing another one of those analyses that I showed you before, those pooled cohort studies which we are about to submit, which again shows where you might want to draw the cutoff, if you like, at least for cancer. It might not be the same for diabetes and for heart disease, but it would make life a lot easier for everybody if we all used the same cutoffs. So I've talked a lot about obesity. And I think that for some cancers at least, it's actually responsible for quite a lot. So for prostate cancer, we often talk about what's called aggressive prostate cancer, which is got a very high grade, the cells look kind of weird, basically, or it's high stage, meaning it's gone beyond the prostate at the time it was diagnosed. And about a quarter of that, I estimate, is due to obesity. And for bowel cancer, for men, again, about a quarter. And again, it will depend on what proportion of the population is obese. These are Australian data, but again, you'll see some New Zealand data in a minute, not much different. And for breast cancer, because it's not a stronger risk factor, it doesn't cause so much. So here are data from New Zealand from the Ministry of Health. And this is the prevalence of obesity. That's a body mass index of 30 or more. From 1997, for males, you can see it's really climbed from about 16% up to 25%. That's a dramatic increase in 10 years. Absolutely dramatic. And here from 20 to just over 30 for women. Again, we are talking about a major epidemic, and a lot of people have suggested that in the 21st century, these kind of increases may actually for the first time see Western populations have reducing life expectancy. And it's something that we need a really strong concerted effort to try to address that topic. And you saw what it took for tobacco. It's going to take the similar effort in terms of obesity. And it's going to take a long time. So, okay, I've talked about diet, and I've talked about obesity. Not just diet contributes to obesity, but so does physical inactivity. But physical inactivity in its own right is also a risk factor, although relatively weak and for not very many cancers. But for bowel cancer, or at least for colon cancer, not for rectal cancer, there's pretty convincing evidence that being physically active reduces the risk, or on the other side of the coin, being inactive increases the risk. And Max Parkin from the UK has estimated that for the UK at least, around 5% of colon cancer is probably due to physical inactivity. And you can see he's estimated smaller amounts for postmenopausal breast cancer and endometrial cancer, for which the evidence is a bit weaker. But physical inactivity is a risk factor in its own right, and being physically active also reduces the risk of becoming obese. So basically, obesity is a product of what we eat and how much we move. So if you eat less and move more, the chances are that we'll become less obese. Now, that's very easy to do for me to say at a population level. It's clearly much more difficult for an individual. I'm getting towards the end, if you're getting sick of me. So this is for the women, so the men can turn off. No, maybe they shouldn't. This is looking at now 3 cancers which we consider to be hormonally dependent cancers: breast, endometrial, and ovary. And this is around postmenopausal hormone replacement therapy. Now, I'm sure many of you in the audience would be familiar with the Women's Health Initiative that I talked about earlier on, which published a paper, I think 10 years ago, showing that women who were assigned to hormone replacement therapy in that randomised trial had about a 25% increased risk of breast cancer. And that's roughly this figure here. For women who get combined therapy, it doubles the risk. This is given to women who have an intact uterus, because otherwise you increase the risk of endometrial cancer. But so as a result of that study, the prescriptions and the use of hormone replacement therapy dropped dramatically. And in several countries, there was a corresponding decrease in the incidence rate of breast cancer very shortly afterwards. And it's actually reasonably convincing evidence, particularly in the US, where it was very common and then it became very uncommon, how quickly the incidence of breast cancer declined. It's one of the few times when you can actually look at a change of a factor like that and attribute it to one thing. Looking at time trends is often really difficult. You only need to talk to climate scientists to realise that that's a problem. Okay, so hormone replacement therapy is another way I consider it to be an avoidable risk of cancer, an avoidable risk factor. The good news is that someone asked me in this talk that I gave at lunchtime, does the risk reduce when you stop? And the answer to that is yes. And in fact, it drops quite quickly. Hence that drop in the incidence rate for breast cancer in the US and possibly Australia as well. I won't go through this other than to say that a pretty well established way of reducing risk of breast cancer is through breastfeeding. Now, looking around my audience, I'm not sure that that's relevant to too many people in the audience, but you've probably many of you got daughters that might be contemplating, and so it is one way of reducing the risk of breast cancer. And all the others are really all about hormones. So the earlier at which girls start menstruating, the older at which women stop menstruating, the older they are when they first have a birth, all increase the risk of breast cancer. And the more children that people have, that women have, that means children, the lower the risk. So, and these are, as I said, hormonally dependent cancers. Often you find people are not willing to talk about those kinds of factors. I am, because it's a fact that these are some of the strongest risk factors for breast cancer. I'm not suggesting that women should start having children at age 20 and then have a dozen before they're age 35. That's not the way that our society works, but it is an issue, the changes that we've seen in terms of breast cancer incidence. All right, so brings me now to talk very briefly about sunlight. Probably don't need to say much about that here. You'd be well aware that Australia and New Zealand enjoy the reputation of having the highest rates of melanoma, and that's largely because of our sun. It's not just melanoma, it's the common skin cancers, basal cell and squamous cell carcinoma. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute about vitamin D and its possible relationship with colorectal cancer. And solariums. I don't know whether they ever took off in New Zealand, did they? They did, right. Well, they certainly did in Australia, which I found staggering to think that people would use them in a country like Australia. Most of them have now gone, fortunately, because there's been a concerted effort by the cancer councils there. What's the situation here? Have they declined in number? Right. Yeah, well, a lot of them have gone out of business in Australia because of them. Colleagues of mine like Craig Sinclair, who's like a dog at a bone. There was a study from colleagues of mine published last year which showed that young people in Australia who used solariums increased their risk of melanoma. And that's the first Australian study, and I don't think there's any from New Zealand, that have shown this. Most of the others have been from North America and Europe, where typically they have lower levels of sunlight. So it's the first that shows that even in a place like Australia with lots of sunlight, you can still increase your risk of melanoma by using sunbeds. So that takes me then to vitamin D. Well, vitamin D's been in the news a lot in the last few years, and there's a big concern that even in places like Australia and New Zealand, people don't have enough vitamin D. So most vitamin D we make after we are exposed to sunlight. So it's actually made in the skin after we're exposed to sunlight, and it's the UVB component of sunlight. So it's much harder to make vitamin D this time of the year, even though it was bright and sunny today in Wellington, than it is in the middle of summer, because there's nowhere near as much UVB. And that's why, commensurately, it's not as harmful also to go into the sun in the middle of winter as it is in the middle of summer in terms of melanoma. So the issue here is, so colorectal cancer, I think the evidence is reasonably good. I'd say probable, not convincing, that vitamin D, having lots of vitamin D reduces the risk of bowel cancer. So what do we do about this? Well, the position statement for the Cancer Council Australia is that when the UV index is above 3 or above, people should practice sun protection, but below that, no. So that means that throughout the winter, in a place like Wellington, there's no need to practice any sun protection. In fact, you should be deliberately trying to get some sunlight. Whereas in the summer, obviously the sort of things that we suggest, i.e. not going outside in the middle of the day. If you are outside, use shade when you can. Wear clothing. Doesn't need to be, UPF 50, but clothing that you can't see through. And then finally, as a last resort, sunscreens. And if you want to get some vitamin D, you can do it in the morning or the afternoon. Go for a run, go for a walk, go for a bike ride. Get some physical activity, get your vitamin D, and don't worry too much about increasing your risk of melanoma. The problem is, I don't know what the balance is. It's not only colorectal cancer, it's also bone health. And at the moment, we really don't know what that relationship is. And there are people, including us, who are doing trials at the moment of using vitamin D supplements. I've talked before about the problems with doing that, but vitamin D, we're putting it to the test to see whether giving people who are 65 or older vitamin D actually reduces their risk of colorectal cancer on the one hand and death on the other. Okay. So here's my take-home messages. Don't smoke. Surprise, surprise. I do apologise for the second one because some of you might not drink, or you might drink at such low levels that it's not an issue. But for the whole population of New Zealand and Australia, one of those, the social report that I was looking at the other day shows quite high levels of hazardous alcohol consumption in New Zealand. So across the population, we should be reducing our alcohol intake. I've talked about eat less and move more, and that seems to be obesity is an emerging risk factor, not just because we've only just discovered in the last 10 years its relationship, but also obesity increasing. I've talked about physical inactivity, and dietary composition isn't as important as we once thought it was, but it is still there. Okay, and again, it's important in terms of maintaining a healthy body weight. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.